Let's come back from the break, please. Here we go. Ms. Katz or Mr. Knight? Oh, I see Mr. Heiser on screen. Mr. Heiser?
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I had a procedural question before we began with Mr. McNally.
All righty.
Do you want us to move the admission of all of the NMOGA exhibits at this time? Was that sort of the agreement of how we're going to do this?
I think that'd be best. I didn't see objections to the NMOGA exhibits.
So I think that the one correction that we would have is that we filed revised hearing exhibits B and revised hearing exhibits 47 to be the ones for use during the hearing. That is the red lines with just the red lines.
Yeah.
So with that, I would move the admission of the NMOGA exhibits.
Would you give us all of the numbers?
Yes, it is NMOGA A1 through A6, B hearing version, the NMOGAs 1 through, count all the way to the end, 46.
Thank you.
47 hearing version, and then 48 through 56.
48 through 56. Terrific. My understanding is there were no objections to those. So unless someone speaks up right now. All right, those are all admitted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. If we could bring Mr. Dennis McNally.
I believe I already made him a panelist.
So Dennis, if you're with us, if you could turn your video on and announce your presence.
Hi, this is Dennis McNally. Hear me okay?
Yes. Dennis is the standard spelling. Would you spell McNally, please, and keep your voice up?
Yes, thank you. It's McNally, MC, cap, N-A-L-L-Y.
Thank you. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that you will tell the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. You're a little quiet. Am I the only one who thinks you're a little quiet? No. The court reporter also thinks you're a little quiet.
Okay, I'll speak up. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And do you need screen presentation privilege?
I would, please.
All right. I'll work on that while Mr. Heiser introduces you.
Mr. McNally, can you please state what your involvement is in this proceeding?
So I have reviewed the photochemical grid modeling conducted for NMED on behalf of NMOGA.
Okay, and I see hands up against ears.
Okay, sorry.
Why don't you say that again, just to make sure the court reporter
Yeah,
got it.
I've reviewed the photochemical grid modeling conducted by NMOGA, conducted by NMED on behalf of NMOGA.
Okay, and this was part of that work, looking at the work that was done by Ramble that Mr. Morris just testified to?
That's correct.
Mr. Heiser, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the board members really would like to be able to reach for the right exhibits.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. So the exhibit that you're going to be speaking to is NMOGA exhibit number 32. Is that an accurate copy of your resume?
It is.
And then is your testimony found in NMOGA exhibits A4 and 45, which reflects your direct and rebuttal testimony?
They are.
And then do you wish to make any modifications to your pre-filed or rebuttal testimony?
I do not.
Okay. And then you're also going to be relying on information found in NMOGA exhibit number 1. That's the New Mexico Ozone Attainment Initiative photochemical modeling study. Is that correct?
That's correct.
and emission exhibits 49, the EPA 2020 design value reports,
That is correct.
and then exhibit 50, which is EPA's guidance on development of modeled emission rates for precursors of, I think it's, I don't have the full title for me, but it basically the MERPS guidance.
I may make reference to that. I did make reference to that in my rebuttal.
Okay, thank you so much. But primarily we're going to be looking at NMOGA exhibits A4 and 45.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you much. Could you state your qualifications as they relate to your participation in this hearing?
Sure. My educational background is I have a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Colorado and a master's degree in atmospheric sciences from the University of California. I've been doing photochemical modeling since, well, I've worked on model development from 85 to 87. I've been working on model application of photochemical grid models and the weather models, the meteorological models that drive those models continuously since 1987.
Okay, thank you. Have you prepared a summary of your direct and rebuttal testimony?
I have.
And those are the aforementioned exhibits A4 and 45?
That is correct.
Okay. Have you prepared a summary of those exhibits and testimony?
I have.
Would you like to provide that summary to the board at this time?
I would, please.
Please proceed.
Can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So in my presentation, I am building kind of on top of the presentation that Ralph just gave. As always, it was a great presentation that presented a whole lot of work very quickly and concisely. So nice job on that. The conclusions of my modeling are pretty simple, and this is just a straight quote out of my my testimony, that the ozone air quality benefits of the proposed rule are quite modest. What impacts the rule have are primarily the result of NOx control measures. Additional controls on oil and gas VOC emissions are not an effective means of controlling ambient ozone levels in New Mexico, except possibly for a limited area in northeastern San Juan County. The NMED modeling approach that was used, I agree with, as Mr. Morris quoted me on during his presentation. The models that were used were consistent with industry standards, the WRF meteorological model, the smoke emissions model, the CAMX photochemical modeling. I have no reason to disagree with the NMED emission estimates and agree that the emissions that were put together by this, being based on RAP emissions, are very well vetted, and I feel real good about that. Performance evaluation was conducted, and I have no reason to doubt the modeling based on that performance evaluation. It met the EPA modeling criteria or guidelines, and it also it tended to overestimate in some places and underestimate in other places, which tends to be something that I like to see in the model. I don't like to see anything that's systematically over, systematically under. So I actually feel good about the model.
And so, Mr. McNally, before you move on to your next slide, in addition to industry standards, would you also find it was consistent with any applicable governmental standards or guidance?
Yeah, EPA has put together guidance for the applications of these air quality models for state implementation plans. And as Mr. Morris pointed out, this isn't really a state implementation plan, but it sort of is. I agree that it's kind of a mini SIP, if you will. And so, yeah, I feel like the guidance was followed in most cases, and there was the guidance gives some flexibility, and there's some of the flexibility that was taken I don't necessarily agree with, and I'll talk about that during my presentation.
Thank you.
So the NMED analysis assessed the model impacts both in a absolute and a relative sense. The majority of the report, the report is primarily what I'm referring to as the TSD that was put together by Ramble. Most of that was based on relative, but part of it was absolute. So as we was already been talked about, absolute is the models, the concentration straight out of the model. In a relative sense, what we do is we scale observations based on changes in the model concentrations. I really prefer the relative approach. It's consistent with the EPA guidelines. It does recognize the uncertainty in the model estimates. These models are phenomenally complex. There's there's a lot of uncertainties in the model formulation. There's uncertainties in the model inputs, and I think by using the model in a relative sense, you're accounting for some of that. You're recognizing, I guess, a better term, some of the uncertainty in the model estimates. I further think, though, that it's important to use model observations that are centered on the base year. That was done in the majority of the presentation in the TSD analysis, but in Mr. Morris's previous presentation and in his testimony, he also used a period that was not. He used more recent observations on that, and that makes me uncomfortable because in Mr. Morris's presentation, he talked about how the design values are based on three-year averages, and that EPA guidance says they should be centered. One of the nice things about that approach is it does take into account the fact that the meteorology is specific to a certain year. And the way that it's an average of an average. I talk about it in my rebuttal. I don't need to go talk about it here, but that base year, in this case 2014, gets weighted heavily in this average of averages that gets used. And I think that the model is much better when that is used. If the NMED had wished to use more recent observations in the modeling, then what should have happened is a new modeling base year should have been developed for a later year. If it was desired to use the 2017 through 2019 design values, there should have been the base year should have been developed for 2019 or as late as could have been used based on data availability. So Mr. Morris presented this already, but the 2028 model projections, what we see is that there's between the base year 2014 now to 2028, there was a 5.6 parts per billion up in northern New Mexico, 5.9 parts per billion in Bernalillo County, 5.2 part per billion in southern New Mexico. And this is the changes without the rule being implemented. The rule emissions impact, and I have no opinion as to how good an estimate these are, how appropriate these are to these estimates are, but the oil and gas NOx in the future year went from about 102,000 tons per year to 56,000 tons per year, about decrease about 46 tons per year, 46,000 tons per year, a 45% reduction. And the oil and gas VOCs went from 211,000 tons per year to 105, about a 50% reduction. So basically a lot of control, a lot of tons. And the impacts of these tons are presented in the next slide, on slide 7. That showed a 1.5 part per billion maximum up in northern New Mexico and San Juan. Other monitors in San Juan, 0.8 part per billion decrease at Bloomfield and minus 1.2 at Substation. There's about 0.5 part per billion in Bernalillo County, and then about a 0.7 parts per billion down in southern New Mexico. So with those anomaly 46,000 tons of NOx, that 105,000 tons per year of VOCs, we ended up with a fairly modest ozone decrease. A lot of my analysis is based on work that was done doing additional analysis on modeling that was already conducted by Ralph for NMED. And And one of those analyses was they did an APCA source apportionment simulation to look at the contribution of oil and gas emissions after the controls were put in place. Now, the slide I'm going to show next it's important that this is not the contribution of the rule. This is the relative view of the ozone form from oil and gas VOC versus oil and gas NOx emissions after the rule were applied, because that was the simulation that was done by NMED. Ralph mentioned the fact that we could have made a model run on this, and the modeling was supplied. NMED gave permission for Ramble to deliver that. They did a great job. They delivered in a timely manner, and thank you so much to both of them for making this data available in time to be able to do quite a bit of analysis that had to happen on this. And we did I did kick around whether I should make the model simulation on that. And what I determined was that while there is uncertainty in the analysis of the NOx and VOC contributions, that is a downside. On the plus side, it's nice for consistency's sake to be using modeling that was conducted by NMED for the rule. And if I start making model runs on different computer systems, we can get a little bit different answers. As I start perturbing model inputs, that just can lead to more inconsistencies. And I thought it was better to accept the uncertainties in using the APCA analysis than to introduce inconsistencies based on doing new modeling. So what we ended up seeing on this was, now when we model the contribution of 56,000 tons per year of NOx and 105,000 tons per year of VOC, we find that there's about a half a part per billion maximum occurring in the San Juan County and up in the San Juan Basin. There's a 1/10 of a part per billion at 2 monitors in Bernalillo County, Santa Fe area, central New Mexico, with 5 of those 7 monitors showing less than 0.1 part per billion impact. And then down in southern New Mexico, the maximum impact was a 0.1 part per billion at less than half of the monitors in southern New Mexico. So of the VOC contributions were pretty small. The NOx contributions are a maximum of 2.5 parts per billion up in the San Juan Basin at Navajo Lake, 0.6 parts per billion in central New Mexico, and up to 0.9 parts per billion at Carlsbad down in Edie County. Looking at that same relative response to these contributions that we looked at before, we also, like Ralph presented earlier, we also looked at the unmonitored area analysis. And what we see there on the left is this is the contribution of this 56,000 tons per year of NOx across the state. What we see there is that up in the oil and gas basins, we see the majority of the contributions. On the left is the NOx. On the right is the contribution with the same scale of the VOC emissions. And what we see on that is of this 105,000 tons per year of VOCs, we have less than a half a part per billion there's half a part per billion in the San Juan Basin, with a few limited areas in northeastern San Juan County going up into the half part per billion, and then nothing over a half a part per billion down in the Permian Basin. So that concludes, a summary of my judgment of the modeling. In the rebuttal, there was some in the rebuttal testimony, I also had a comment about some of the National Park Service testimony, and in that their presentation, it would be easy to interpret their presentation to say that they're using ethane as a surrogate for VOC emissions. And I think ethane is really useful as a tracer for oil and gas emission sources. oil and gas sources tend to have more ethane emissions than other sources, other anthropogenic sources, or biogenic sources for that matter. So it's a useful tracer, but it's a little misleading because ethane is not regulated as a VOC since it's, as EPA calls it, negligibly reactive. So while it can be ethane emissions from the oil and gas activities, it's not forming very much ozone from that. So just more of a comment to keep track. And then I'm just going to close it with my conclusions again, but I'm not going to bore you all by reading it again. So thank you for your time, and thank you, Ralph, for doing the heavy lifting of introducing the study for me so I didn't have to.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. McNally. I have no further questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you, Mr. McNally and Mr. Heiser. Ms. Katz or Mr. Knight, do you have a question? Mr. McNally.
No questions from the department.
All right, thank you. Ms. Fox?
No questions. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. McNally.
Okay. Ms. Braños?
No questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Professor Pasiniak?
No questions, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, thank you. Ms. DeVore or Mr. Weimont? Mr. Nykiel?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. DeSalen?
Yes, Madam Hearing Officer, thank you. I have a few questions.
Go ahead.
Good morning, Mr. McNally, and I want to thank you also for your presentation. I just have a few questions here. Now, the gist of your testimony, as I understand it, is that the proposed regulations, if they're put in place, would only have a very modest beneficial effect on air pollution in New Mexico. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
And as I understand it, the effects that you're looking at are at monitoring stations located in a relatively small number of locations around the state, and particularly in those counties that are affected here. Is that correct?
I did look at the impacts at the stations, but I also looked at the impacts away from the stations, as I showed in my earlier unmonitored area analysis.
Okay, but nevertheless, that's a limited number of stations when you look at all of the air and all of the area that we're talking about in New Mexico.
I agree that the stations, there are limited stations in New Mexico, but
Okay.
again, I did look at areas not at the monitors also.
Okay, thank you. So there are going to be areas where the pollutant levels are actually lower or they're actually higher than what your model predicts. Is that correct?
Well, the impacts of the oil and gas are just what the model had, and if there are limitations in the model, there could be higher contributions or lower contributions.
Okay, thank you. And for example, areas that are close to an oil and gas facility, and I understand that meteorology and wind direction, and there are going to be a lot of factors that are going to affect this. But as a general matter, areas that are located closer to oil and gas facilities are generally going to have higher levels of ozone and other pollutants. Do you agree with that?
Areas in the vicinity of the emission sources do tend to have higher ozone concentrations. That can be from the oil and gas regions. It could also be like in the Albuquerque, Santa Fe area from other emission sources too.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McNally. I don't have any other questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. DeSalen. Let's see, Mr. Dano? Oh, no, I'm sorry. I skipped over Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose?
No questions.
Thank you. Mr. Jano?
No questions.
All right, Mr. Boutier?
No questions, thank you.
Ms. Gutierrez?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Colclisher?
No questions, thank you.
And Ms. Witherspoon? Okay. I'm going to turn to the board members. In the event they have questions, if you are not a panelist, you're on this platform and have a question, please reach out to me in chat. So let me start with Madam Chair.
Madam Hearing Officer, I just have a couple of questions, maybe just one. Mr. McNally, going back to the presentation that we had earlier by Mr. Morris and some of the rebuttals that he had for Mr. Blewett's presentation the day before. And so I just want to make sure I'm clear. So I know in his presentation earlier on slide 26 of 28 that he presented this morning, he said in evaluating emission control strategies for reducing ozone concentrations, the standard practice is to evaluate the combined effects of control strategy, VOC, and NOx emission reductions in ozone concentrations. So I know in your conclusion, you were saying that primarily the rule is focused on, or the result of the NOx control measures would be the any benefit, as you put it, modest benefits. So could you just walk me through, I guess in Mr. Morris's testimony, the standard practice and what's your perspective on what that standard practice is, if there is a standard practice, and how you see that, and how you see in your conclusion we should look at NOx versus the VOCs.
Yeah, so in a normal SIP development, what tends to happen is you will first develop the future case, and then you'll assess that, and that'll say if you're out of attainment, if you're in attainment, then you're lucky. The rules that are already on the books will get you into attainment. You're done. Write your SIP and turn it in. If you're out of attainment, then what you're going to do is you're going to put together controls to get that area into attainment. And normally what you'll do is you'll start with some fairly broad brush, not really a rule, but broad brush emission perturbations, I would say. So let's go in and let's cut the anthropogenic NOx by 25%. And separately, let's cut the anthropogenic VOCs by 25%. And then maybe we would do a simulation where we would cut both. And that would give you an idea of, is the area more NOx sensitive, more VOC sensitive, or maybe equally sensitive. Once you had that data available to you, then you would use that to guide what control strategies you might want to look at. Maybe you would, maybe that would point you towards more of a NOx controls kind of a strategy, or maybe more of a VOC strategy. And that sort of a step doesn't appear to have taken place here. They got to the future year, and then they applied a control to that to say where it would get. And I think had that initial NOx look versus VOC look happened, maybe the rule would have been structured in a different way.
Thank you for that response, Mr. McNally. I just have another follow-up question to that. So I guess I'm looking at the standard practice in the industry. Have you seen I don't know if you have experience working beyond New Mexico and in other areas where we're looking at these models? Do you have that experience?
Yeah, I do. I've worked extensively in the Northeast, in Denver, and a lot of work in Houston.
Okay, in those model or in those analysis, is it the standard practice to look at the VOCs and NOx emission reductions on the ozone concentrations and the impacts?
like you say, in the screening before you're developing strategies, yes. But oftentimes when a strategy does get modeled, since you've already been informed by whether you need VOC control or NOx control, it would not be typical that you would break out the impacts of each pollutant specifically.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
Thank you. Vice Chair Trujillo Davis, do you have questions of Mr. McNally?
Hello, Mr. McNally. Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it. I just had one or two quick questions here. You were mentioning that ethane is a good tracer, but it can be misleading in analysis. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Currently, do you see reductions in ethane with the current reduction equipment, like a VRU, closed sleeve hatches, things like that? Do you see ethane reduce as well, or does it not seem to be impacted by those other measures?
Now, I would expect ethane emissions to decrease as controls on other VOCs from oil and gas activity decrease are put into place.
Okay, so I just want to understand where you were talking about what's misleading. I don't think I understood that point.
So when the Park Service, as part of their field program that they did, they collected ethane concentrations, and then as surrogates for what the source of the VOC emissions were coming from. But then in the presentation, what I think they should have done was showed what the full VOC concentrations are, not just what the ethane concentrations are. Because the full VOC contributions will also include things like biogenics from motor vehicles, and the signatures would be pretty different.
I understand. Thank you very much for clearing that up for me.
All right, thank you. Member Cates, do you have questions of Mr. McNally?
Yeah, a couple of quick ones here. Good morning, Sarah. Thanks for the testimony. So, just a point of clarification: is it your view that the rules that we're considering, if they're implemented, they're going to have a minimal effect overall in terms of the state as a whole? Is that your? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, it's a pretty modest impact.
Right. Now, if you look at the hot spots down, I'm thinking back to your maps. If you look at the hot spots in the Permian Basin and up around Farmington, would it be your contention that the effect of these rules, if implemented, would have a minimal impact there as well?
That I've just switched back to the slide that shows this, Kate. So the impacts are, there are local impacts that are higher than at the monitors that I presented, certainly, but the impacts are still on the range of under a very limited area of 3 to 4 parts per billion from these controls, and primarily from the NOx.
So then you would say, in addition, your position would be that in addition to having sort of an extremely modest impact statewide, that the impact locally would be modest as well. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, given the 70 part per billion standard, what is modest, those are soft numbers, if you will. But this rule is not going to have a large impact.
Okay, that's all I got. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Member Bitzer?
Yeah, real quick on the modest impact on the VOX up in the Farmington area. part of that modest impact drifts over the border into, what is that, Animas La Plata region of Colorado. Would this modest impact potentially, and this may be a question for the state, I don't know, but would this modest impact potentially have an impact on our ability to retain and or enhance our good neighbor obligations under EPA's good neighbor rule?
I'm afraid I don't know how to answer that.
I'm sorry, that could be a question maybe for later for the environment staff too, because I think that drifts back over on across their side of the border. That's all I had.
All right, thank you. Member Duvall.
Yes, thanks, Mr. McNally. I appreciate your testimony. I am curious about some points that might seem a little overly academic, but I think you're in a good position to answer these. So the weather inputs into the model, I was a little confused about that. You made mention that it was, I believe, 2014 that the simulations were based on. I mean, was there any like spin up process going to that, or was it just using the meteorological data from that single year using based that the projections were based on?
Yeah, so the model was just run for the ozone season of 2014.
Okay.
But the model was run with a 15-day spin up, if you will. We start the model initialization is based on the global model simulation, which is at a very coarse resolution.
Sure.
And the model is run for 15 days to sort of flush, that's. And then the model starts to be used for the simulation that we're going to use. But yeah.
Okay, because I was curious because I mean there's obviously publicly available data like the CMIP future climate projections from that. I'm assuming you're familiar with that framework.
I'm generally available or generally familiar with the climate models.
Yeah. So I was just curious, like if we're and this again could be a question for the state if they were the ones that were running the models, but I think it would be standard practice to validate with known meteorological parameters and then run forward with projected climate simulations. So kind of like modeling within the model, in a sense, if you're trying to get at what projections for say 2028 or 2050 or 2100 would be, that like we should be using future climate projections and not relying on potentially a single data year.
No, I certainly don't disagree with your assessment on that. But if you're using a model to look at control strategies, you have to be able to isolate cause and effect in the model. And the way that we do this is in the current, as was done here and is typically done in the air quality community, is we make an assumption that the weather in the future year, in this case 2028, is going to be identical to what the weather was in 2014.
And that's exactly my point. That's an unreasonable assumption.
And that's because you've got to anchor some degrees of freedom in order to isolate what the impacts of the emissions are.
I understand the challenges of doing that, yes, but yeah, I think you see my point too, that like there are these frameworks that we could use with pretty well vetted, and it wouldn't just be one model, right? I mean, there's like 15 that you could do a suite and put some error bars around this too, instead of just saying it's going to be 7%. That we have a confidence interval around some of these numbers. So I apologize for missing this morning's presentation. I was actually I was teaching, But yeah, I need to look more at the morning's. I'm assuming this is all being recorded, and I'll look at this morning's testimony. But yeah, I think I will end my statements with a quote that I'm sure you're familiar with by George Box, that all models are wrong, some are useful.
Thank you.
All right, I'm done.
All right, thank you, Member Duvall. Member Garcia?
No questions, thank you.
All right, thank you. And Member Honker?
Yes, just one question, and thanks for the very interesting presentation. I believe later in the hearing we're going to be looking at examples of approaches that Pennsylvania and Colorado have taken. I was curious as to whether you had reviewed any modeling that either of those states had done to support any revisions they've made in their programs.
So in Colorado, we were, until very recently, we were a subcontractor to Ramble in putting together those SIPs. So we've been involved with putting together SIPs in Colorado since I think about 2003. So I'm pretty familiar with how the modeling was put together. I am certainly less familiar with how the emissions inventories were put together to support that modeling.
Okay, and do you have any familiarity with the Pennsylvania program?
I do not have familiarity with Pennsylvania.
Okay, all right, thank you. No other questions.
All right, thank you. Madam Chair, I understand you have a follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer. I apologize that this came up as I was listening to the other questions. Mr. McNally, I just wanted to get my head around, you know, as Member Duvall said, you know, we get all these values out of numbers, and we're trying to look at data and trying to look at various aspects objectively, scientifically. So you used the term modest. And in one of, I think in one of the conclusions or one of the statements, what do you see as modest? What's your definition of modest?
So that's a great question. I would say a modest is a way of looking at what is, it really comes down to a value, I guess. And I see modest as being, it's not going to have it's a lot of control that's going to get not a huge impact. It's going to get some impact. So it's very difficult, and I to quantify exactly. I mean, is 3 not and 4 yes? No, I wouldn't say that. It's more of just a feeling on the number.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to get my head around that as so you're looking at modest, maybe not solely in the quantifiable terms, and more in looking at modest as other inputs. Is that how I understand your definition?
Yes, I'm looking at modest impacts of yes, I guess that would be a safe assumption.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that clarification.
All right, thank you. Mr. Heiser, will you have any follow-up?
I think just perhaps 2 questions, Madam Hearing Officer. Mr. McNally, Chair Sweetness, I think, asked a really good question about the standard practice that was used. And she asked you, I think, a little bit about your experience potentially in Houston and Denver. In those areas, have those agencies looked at the balance of where the emissions reductions are more effective or less effective in trying to craft the emission control strategies? So whether NOx is more effective or VOCs are more effective in the Houston Basin or the Denver Basin?
Yeah, when when you're doing the analysis on that, you certainly do take into account the spatial impacts of that. Do the controls impact areas that are maybe close to attainment or have a large population. So yeah, you do examine spatial impacts of controls.
Yeah. And then if I could have you back up to slide 9 of your presentation. And so when you're talking a little bit about the modest impact that Chair Swain just asked you about, was part of where you're coming from that is you look at 56,000 tons a year of NOx or 105,000 tons a year of NOx, and then you look at what the part per billion impact, or in this case, point part per billion impact of that. That's sort of what you're saying is the modest. It seems that there's a small movement in the ambient concentration for a whole lot of tons on the emission side.
That's what I was trying to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That
Mr.
completes
Heiser?
my questions. Yes.
I'm sorry. Mr. Heiser, Member Duvall has reached out to ask another question, and if you need follow-up after that, we'll certainly allow it. Member Duvall.
Yeah, thanks again for time. I bristled a bit at the dismissal of ethane as a tracer. Why do we use tracers? It's because it's an easier thing to measure than the actual thing, right? So I don't know. I guess I was a little confused at the what seemed to be dismissive of the ethane data when it's a really good proxy because it's a very simple hydrocarbon, it's easy to measure, and we know that it literally traces, i.e. correlates with these other VOCs. So I was just a little confused as to why that would be sort of dismissed in the other from the other presentation.
I apologize if it came across as I was being dismissal, because I think I stated that I think it's a very useful thing, but I think when you start looking at the ozone forming potential of air, you should be looking at the VOCs in that air, not at the ethane concentrations in that air. That's my only point on it.
Granted. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I didn't mean to impugn. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that that's like clear that to maybe folks that don't have the same background that you do, that like the reason you use a tracer is because it's an easier molecule to measure with given instrumentation than perhaps like a more sophisticated gas analysis system. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything further, Mr. Heiser?
No, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, thank you. If there's no reason not to excuse Mr. McNally, we will excuse him, and thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right. I'm the presenter again. All right. Where are we going next? I know the names of the other witnesses who will be testifying on modeling, but I'm not sure exactly what order they're going to be testifying in. I see Mr. Rose on the screen.
We have Mr. Blewett, who has testimony on the modeling as well, but in terms of order, we could go next. I don't think there's any preference, but however you want to handle that.
All right. Would folks prefer to break for lunch, knowing that we would have to break in, about 15 minutes or so anyway? How do you feel about that, Mr. Rose?
That would be fine, I think. I don't know how long Mr. Blewett's direct is going to take, but my sense is it'll be about the 15 minutes, and any questioning probably would be better if it directly followed his testimony as opposed to there being a gap. So I think I'd prefer breaking now and then reconvening after the public testimony at 1 o'clock.
Okay. I'd rather not take an extra long lunch if there's something else we can do now. Let me see here. Ms. Katz, I don't know if you have any ideas. It might be possible to take someone who, for example, is already on the platform by way of a public comment, just to get us a little closer to noon. Oh, if we reconvene at 12:30, that's a question from a board member. Then we could take a whole half hour of technical testimony before 1. How does that sound?
That'd be fine, Madam Hearing Officer.
All right, and I see Ms. Katz nodding. All right, so let's adjourn for lunch. It's 11:45. We'll return at 12:30 with Mr. Blewett. Thank you all.